The next gin we're going to look at is North Yorkshire. Anybody heard of the whole of Hooting? No? So the whole of Hooting is a large scar on the landscape about 10 miles north of Pickering on the road to Whitby. Some people say it was created by a Yorkshire farmer who dropped a penny down a rabbit hole and was trying to get his penny back. But I know it was really created by the Ice Age. And the reason I know that is because within the whole of Hooting is a little plant called the dwarf cornel. Now this is an Arctic plant that generally grows above the Arctic Circle. The furthest south place on the planet we find this plant is the whole of Hooting. However, it's a tiny little thing. Looks a bit like a four-leaf clover with a tiny little white flower. It's very difficult to find. So when botanists are looking for it, what they actually look for are heather and bilberries growing together. Because where we find heather and bilberries together, the soil conditions are right for the dwarf cornel. So we took the signature recipe, jiggled it slightly, added heather and bilberries and a little bit of thyme, and that produced the North Yorkshire gin. The next one we're going to look at is the East Yorkshire gin. Probably my favourite. Slightly different to the other London dries in that we've added a little bit of honey. So it's slightly sweeter, so more of an Old Tom gin. Although it is a London dry gin, it is in the style of an Old Tom. Now the botanicals we use for this, the first thing is kelp. And that's because the East Riding coast has got a very large coastline. But it's also a nod back to the Navy and a lot of the historic things that happened around East Riding in the early 1800s, late 1700s. If you remember, there was a chap, independent MP for Hull, a chap called William Wilberforce. And as a nod back to William Wilberforce and his involvement, particularly in the abolition movement, then we have a little thing called baobab. And baobab fruit comes from the baobab tree. Very difficult to harvest, it only flowers and it only seeds once every 6 to 7 years. But we use the baobab to get rid of the saltiness of the kelp. Another thing we have is hawthorn berries off the East Riding wolds, a little bit of honey and a slight piece of lavender. A wonderful gin, generally a lady's favourite, and I think that's because of the addition of the honey. The next gin you'll then try will be the South Yorkshire gin. And as we all know, South Yorkshire isn't really botanically favourite. South Yorkshire's all about coal and steel. And I thought, what am I going to do as far as adding something for the South Yorkshire gin when we start thinking about botanicals? And I thought about the time when I first left the military and I bought a butcher shop in York and I trained to be a butcher. And one of the favourite things that I used to do was called a Barnsley chop. And a Barnsley chop is a double lamb chop off the front end of the lamb. And it's a famous chop or a famous meat dish that they served around Barnsley and South Yorkshire. And they obviously served it with a mint sauce and a little bit of rosemary. So we jigged up the recipe again, we added rosemary, we added mint, and that produced the South Yorkshire gin. Interestingly, just got 3 stars at the Great Taste Awards this year and came third out of 145,000 food products. A lovely gin. We do use it as a replacement for Hendrick's because in the Hooting Owl we don't stock Hendrick's. So if somebody asks us for an Hendrick's, we explain how we don't stock it and we'll simply serve them a South Yorkshire with a nice chunk of cucumber. The next one we look at is the West Riding gin. Now the West Riding gin is really a nod back to the West Riding Regiment, as the East Riding gin is a bit of a nod to the East Riding Regiment. Now the West Riding Regiment came out of Bradford. However, the regimental headquarters was in York on Clifford Street. When I started talking about the West Riding gin, I also thought about my upbringing. I was brought up in Bradford, where the West Riding Regiment came from. Now the West Riding Regiment served in India from 1800 to 1840. And that's really where gin and tonic came from. And the reason it came from India is because back in the day, British soldiers were given quinine to help stave off malaria. Some of them wouldn't drink it. Quinine's the bitter element that you find in tonic water. And they wouldn't drink it because of its bitterness. So the government held a competition in the late 1700s with all the beverage companies in London to try and get somebody to invent a drink to get quinine into their soldiers. The winner of that competition in 1783 was Schweppes, when they invented Indian tonic water. This tonic water was then sent out to India and it was given to the troops every morning to help stave off malaria. However, some of the officers realised it was still too bitter. So they added gin to it. And that's where gin and tonic came from. So the first gin and tonics were probably drunk by the West Riding Regiment in India in the early 1800s. This is also a nod not only back to that Indian history, but also to the history of Bradford, because Bradford's always had this relationship with the Indian subcontinent. And as a matter of that, we make a curry in a bottle. So it's cardamom, cumin, turmeric, coriander, all those Indian spices, and it produces a spice gin. We generally finish it off with ginger, so we'll drink it with a ginger ale, or if you prefer, a ginger beer. The last gin we look at is Veterans. The Veterans gin is identical to the signature gin, so the identical recipe. The only difference being that we've added less water. So this is a gin served at 48% ABV. I generally drink it neat over ice as a nightcap, and we tell a bit of a story. It's a bit of a nod back in the day when the British Army and the Navy used to be given their rum ration. You may not know, but all spirits on Navy ships must be 57.5% ABV. And the reason for that is that back in the day when we used to have wooden ships and wooden barrels, and we get into conflict or get into battle, and cannonball would come through the sides of the ships, break open the barrel, splash our cannon, and we couldn't fire back. Until a scientist, a chemist, pointed out to the Ministry of Defence that the explosive point of alcohol is 57.5% ABV. So they then passed a law that all spirits on Navy ships must be 57.5% ABV. Now time for a little bit of military banter. As we all know, sailors are incapable of drinking spirits of such high strength. So as a result, the boatswain used to water those spirits down. So he'd take the spirit, he'd add half water to it, and then give it to the sailors as their rum ration. They'd obviously get upset and ask the boatswain to prove that the spirit was full strength before he watered it down. And the way he would do that, he would add a bit of gunpowder to a saucer, add a bit of the spirit and light it. And if it lit, it proved it was 57.5% ABV, which is where the term proof comes from. Obviously, being military, being army and not navy, we don't need to water ours down, so we drink ours neat at 58%. It's just a joke to our navy brethren. So that's the 6 gins that you would be tasting while you're on our Tour de Yorkshire tour. In addition to that, we've then got 6 fruit gins, we've then got our 3 rums, and then there's a couple of specials. We just give you small tasters, and then at the end of that session, then you can have your second double gin and tonic. Tours last about 2 hours. On a normal tour, we do a full hoot for groups of 8 to 12 people, and the full hoot will last for about 3 hours. We have a whale of a time. Check it out, have a look at our website, we'd love to see you.